Hi, I'm Doreen Redmond from AARP North Dakota, and I'm so glad you've joined us today for the Passport to Healthy Living program on getting your yard ready for fall. Can't believe we're talking about that already, but it is around the corner and we do need to start thinking about it. We're thrilled to have Don Kinsler coming back with us today. He was with us last year, and we've all learned so much from him over the years. And just to remind you, for more than 60 years, AARP has been working to improve the lives and empower all of us who are 50 plus to live our best lives. And gardening and yard work bring joy and exercise to many of us in the summer months. And it's just, it's sad to see it winding down soon, but that's North Dakota. And so here we are, and we just have to figure out how to get our yards ready for fall. And Don Kinsler is going to tell us all about it. So let's hear from Don and at the NDSU Extension in Cass County about how we can best prepare our yards for fall and winter ahead.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me again. This is always a fascinating time, and even though we're still in August, before we know it, fall is going to be coming, and many of things around our yard and garden in September, we start taking action to prepare things. And I never get sad about this time of year as we approach fall. I never get sad because the things that we do this fall are an investment in next year's yard, garden, and lawn. So the actions that we take that we're going to go through today, I really look at as we're already starting next spring's growing season. So it's not like putting your lawnmower away for the fall. No, instead, the things that we do are actually the investment in next year. So let's take a look at some of the fall tasks in yard and garden. And most of these will be starting in probably a couple of weeks in September or so. So let's go through the different things around the yard and garden. And of course, the fall. A wonderful time just to enjoy. The daylight even starts getting a little different look. The sun gets a little bit lower, and oftentimes the colors intensify, not just on the trees and shrubs that start turning color, but even the shadows and just the look of fall. The sunny days just develop a wonderful look and an atmosphere, and it's such a wonderful time just to enjoy. And in the perennial gardens, the landscape really start developing a wonderful fall look. So let's take a look. First of all, at lawn care. The fall is a really important time. September is a very important month. Again, it's an investment in next year's lawn. So in September here, Labor Day is the time to fertilize our lawns. If you were going to fertilize one time a year, fall in September around Labor Day is the preferred time. Now, there's been a lot of turf research done on when is the best time of year to actually fertilize a lawn. When is the lawn grass best able to utilize and most in need of that extra nutrition? So the turf researchers have found that in September, that is the most important time of year to apply lawn fertilizer. Now, if we think about it, often in September, our lawns get that second wind, don't they? We'll usually get more moisture, the temperatures start cooling, and our grass gets that second wind again. And if we give it the nutrition from fertilizer, that lawn grass will develop a deeper root system. It'll use that nutrition for a nice, deep, vigorous root system. And that vigorous root system will be there next year, of course, next spring. And that will help that lawn to pump more moisture up from down below. And also that increased nutrition applied in September will help the lawn to spread and fill out. If there are any little gaps in the lawn, it tends to fill out. So if you were going to ignore all other lawn fertilizing, September is the time to do it. Very important. In fact, last September, when I was fertilizing our lawn, it was a day where rain was anticipated. So I thought, I'm going to get my fertilizer down. Okay. Well, I got 3/4 of the lawn done, and then it actually did start to rain. So I had to stop. Well, I didn't get back to it. And this spring, there was a very sharp line a demarcation line where I'd fertilized last September. It was nice, green, and lush. And the area that was not fertilized was lighter green and just did not look as healthy. And of course, the secondary time to apply fertilizer is in May, around Memorial Day. But very important, that fall fertilizing. We can't emphasize that enough for lawn care and lawn health. The second thing, of course, to do in mid-September or anytime really from the 1st of September to the 15th is to seed any areas that became thin, or if your lawn needs overseeding, September is the time to do it. Now, the cutoff is really about the, September 15th. And when I say cutoff, we need to get the seed in place in the ground before September 15th, so it has time to sprout, grow, and establish before winter sets in. One key point in getting lawn grass seed to be successful, of course, is the moisture. Right after seeding, very important to start the moisture. And sometimes we have to water twice a day. The seed bed should be what I call dark moist, continually dark and moist throughout the period of time in which it takes to germinate. So lawn care, very, very important time in September. Also in the lawn, a wonderful time to control hard to kill weeds, or really any weeds in the lawn. And there's a reason for this. And of course, here we have a photo of creeping Charlie in the lawn and also thistle. There's a reason why fall is a wonderful time to control these weeds. And that is because in the fall of the year, as the day lengths start shortening, weeds, perennial weeds know that winter's coming, and they start stocking up material down in the roots so they can come back to haunt you next spring. So if we apply herbicides, weed killers, to these weeds in the fall and September, they will carry that herbicide down into the roots and you'll be more successful with control. Now, some of the very hard to kill weeds like the creeping Charlie need an application in September and then probably again next May. But there's a wonderful opportunity in the fall in September to do the weed control in the lawn. In the fall of the year, now we're talking all the way into October on lawn care. In the fall of the year, we usually recommend reducing the mowing height. Now, during the course of the spring, summer, and early fall, the mowing height should be about 3 inches at least. Now, a lot of turf research has been done to determine what is the healthiest mowing height for lawn. And the turf research has always proven that a taller mowing height of about 3 inches is the optimum for a healthy lawn. That does a couple of things. It shades the roots so you don't get as much evaporation. It keeps the roots cool, which grass likes. It also helps you outcompete the weeds. It shades some of the weeds. So a taller mowing height, about 3 inches, but then in October for the final 1 or 2 mowings to reduce the height down to about 1.5 to 2 inches for the fall of the year. It's kind of important then that we don't have quite such a high grass plant going into winter. Otherwise, we could get mold and matting and several other items. Now, there's a really, really good Minnesota lawn care calendar. A person can bring this up just simply by doing an online search of Minnesota Lawn Care Calendar. And of course, this applies to North Dakota as well. And it tells some very important things. Of course, mowing and some of these things are obvious, but mowing and watering, but such as aerating, dethatching, weed control. It gives the best time to do it and a kind of an okay time to do it. You'll notice on fertilizing, they mentioned early August through mid-October. Really, September is the month in between there. And of course, the okay time is then May through June. So good resource. And of course, anytime we're doing these things on the lawn, it always helps to have somebody sitting there making sure we're doing it right, doesn't it? I can never resist throwing that in. In the fall of the year also, it's interesting, there's no need to rake the leaves that might fall from trees onto the lawn. There's no need to rake them. There's fascinating research that's been done by Ohio State University to see what if we just mowed over those leaves and mulched them down in, would that have benefit to the lawn? And yes, it sure does. Through a study that covered a number of years, when leaves were purposely mowed down in, mulched down into the lawn, they discovered a couple of things. That effectively added like a compost to the lawn. It added nutrition, so the lawn grass grew better. They were able to examine the roots, and so a lawn on which the leaves had been mowed in, mulched in, the root system was better. And of course, it helped conserve soil moisture too. And also, it helped diminish weeds. The effect of this leaf material being composted down in, mulched down in, really did help diminish weeds also, especially when this is done each year. And of course, if the weed layer is really, really thick, then you may need to go over it a couple of times, or you might need to remove some of the leaves and mulch in the remainder. So it's interesting. I always enjoy that mowing over the leaves. So it isn't just that we're being lazy and instead of raking the leaves, we're just mowing over them. There's actually a really, really good reason for mowing them down into the lawn. Now let's turn to the vegetable garden here in late summer and early fall. Of course, pumpkins, squash, carrots, onions, potatoes can all be harvested in September, about the time of the last frost. We all hear about the frost on the pumpkins. And so all of these materials can tolerate a little bit of light frost. On pumpkins and squash, it kind of actually helps them to harden up a bit before storage. And we can dig and divide rhubarb in September. It can also be done next May. The asparagus tops, anyone who has asparagus, those tops are best left intact over winter. As long as we mentioned rhubarb stalks, after a really heavy frost, the stalks should be removed and cleaned up. There are different foliage type leaf diseases that will attack rhubarb, and sometimes there will be little discolored stem type blights that can also attack rhubarb stems. So rhubarb, after it's been totally blackened and softened down by frost, really that should be taken up and removed. Let's see, before I pass on, look at the nice squash in the lower right-hand corner. How do we know if squash is ready to be picked or harvested? And of course, if with a killing frost, of course, the vines are going to die. And of course, then everything that's in the squash patch should be harvested. But before that, if you're hungry for some squash and wonder, is it ripe enough? Can I pick one? A couple of indications in that squash. Notice how what is called the ground spot, that non-green colored spot, that has turned from yellow to a nice orange. That's one indication. Also, look at the skin of the squash, how it's got a soft gloss, but it generally is duller in sheen than it is during the rest of the growing season. During the rest of the growing season, they're very shiny. Also, if you took your thumbnail, this ripe squash would not be able to be indented with your thumbnail. On a squash that has not reached maturity yet, that unripe squash can easily be dented with your thumbnail. So a good squash example there, ready to harvest. Boy, those are going to taste good again, aren't they? When cleaning up a garden, whether you've got a raised garden or an in-ground garden or even gardening in containers, it's important in the fall of the year after frost or about the time of frost to remove the plants and discard, especially things that continually seem to have disease problems like tomato, pepper, cucumber vines, all of the things that typically are very prone to leaf spots, leaf diseases. Those should be totally removed from the vegetable garden or the containers in which you're growing them. And also weeds. It's easy to become complacent by the end of summer with weeds. And with weeds, of course, we see like the thistle there that's blooming, they produce so many seeds. And one weed that is left in place can produce thousands of seeds, and then those seeds are going to fall, and we'll be battling those seeds for years to come. So any weed that you can reduce or keep from going to seed will be that much less work next year. See, all of these things that we're doing this late summer and fall are investments in the future. So it's actually a fun challenge to remove all the weeds in your garden before they go to seed, because then I'm thinking, gosh, if I catch all these, they're not producing seed. And then next year, I'll probably have a lighter load in weeding the vegetable garden. Fall is also a good time to add leaves, compost. Rototilling and spading in the fall of the year can help it can help turn the soil over so that any insects or diseases that are trying to winter there, that have crawled into the soil, might be exposed to the severity of the winter, and some of the insects and diseases can be killed instead of surviving winter if we rototill in the fall. Next, let's go to trees and shrubs. Now, trees and shrubs can certainly be planted in the fall of the year. September is a great month. Now, sometimes we might wonder, well, let's see, if I've got some shrubs or a tree I'd like to plant, would it be better just to wait until next spring? Well, trees and shrubs have the ability to produce roots yet this fall, until the soil temperature reaches about 40 degrees. And so usually we have all the way through September and most of October until that soil gets down below that 40-degree point. So a tree or shrub planted in September will continue to produce roots. And so that root system accomplished this fall will put you that much farther ahead for next year. So as opposed to waiting till next spring, there are definite advantages. You do get a root system that has already started to grow, which can then be a big advantage instead of waiting until next spring. Evergreens should be watered in the fall of the year. Evergreens are very prone to winter burn. Sometimes the winter winds will just desiccate the foliage. Sometimes it can be the sunlight, the winter sunlight, that can burn evergreens. And the more fluid that is up in the evergreen foliage, the foliage will be better able to withstand the drying effect. So watering evergreens, giving them a really, really good soak, really in September. Sometimes a person hears the recommendation, do it right before freeze up, but really we should start getting that foliage well hydrated even in September and October. So not right before the final hard freeze in October before everything freezes up. Start a little earlier watering evergreens. Fall is a great time to add a circle of mulch around the trees. Trees love it. Then there's less damage from mowers and string trimmers. Also, to put tree guards around young trees to fence against rabbits and to prevent some of the winter sunburn injury on young trees as well. Now, occasionally I'm asked, what is the best time in the fall to do pruning? Is there a point at which it's kind of too late to do pruning? But really, there's no good reason to do any pruning in the fall of the year. And there's lots of bad reasons to do pruning in the fall. And here's the reason. Plants are really quite smart. They can sense in the fall of the year that the day lengths are shortening. Plants know that. They're sensing that the days are becoming shorter, and they know that winter is coming. So plants start to slow their growth, shut down their growth in preparation for winter. Part of that slowing means their cell division isn't going on. And if we do pruning cuts in the fall of the year, those pruning cuts are not sealed over by their cells because the trees just aren't doing that anymore. The shrubs just aren't dividing cells the way they do in early spring. So if we do pruning in the fall of the year, we're leaving more open wounds. And those open wounds could be more susceptible to winter dieback. So there's really not a good reason to prune in the fall, and some pretty serious bad reasons to do fall pruning. So it's better just to wait until spring. Also, I might mention the lower right-hand figure there. Um, Sometimes it's better to prune shrubs rather than using that hedge trimmer, unless it's a formal hedge, then that works well. But sometimes shrubs are better selectively pruned, like the left-hand photo where they're selectively cutting the branches. Sometimes the shearing like that can give kind of an unnatural look to a shrub, unless of course there's a reason that you are trimming something into a shape. I always enjoy this photo. I oftentimes think that there's got to be a story behind this between the two neighbors. So anyway, unless you're trying to shear something into a specific shape, there's really it's really preferred to give natural looks to our shrubbery rather than such a tight shearing. So roses, let's talk about those. Now roses in the spring, roses in the fall, I should say, are best delayed until spring for the pruning. So unless you need to prune the roses in order to cover them or protect them, it's better to delay the pruning until spring. Now, many of the rose bushes, the shrub type roses that many of us grow in North Dakota here, are the hardy type of shrub roses that really winter well without covering. So any of the hardy type, many of us grow the Canadian type roses, those really do not need winter cover. And so they are best not pruned in the fall of the year. Better to wait until next spring. Again, the reason for that is by opening up the canes with a pruning cut, there's more chance of winter dieback. Now, rabbits love rose bushes in the wintertime. They just love, you'd think something that thorny they wouldn't eat, but they really do go after roses. So if a person's been bothered with rabbit damage around roses, really a fencing in the fall of the year would be a good idea. Now let's talk about fruit trees. Some of the insects, such as apple maggot, that affects apple fruit. Apple maggot is the one that causes the streaking through apples. The adult fly lays an egg on the apple in summer, and that egg hatches into a larvae that tunnels through the apple and causes those brown streaks. And when the apples fall like this, there's more likelihood that those maggots are going to winter either on that fallen apple or down in the soil. So as soon as apples fall from the tree, it's important to rake them up and dispose. Then in that way, we can help reduce apple maggots. Also, leaf type diseases. We mentioned mulching leaves in with the lawnmower into lawn, but apple leaves really are better raked up and disposed of because there are different leaf type diseases such as apple scab that cause leaf blights and blemishes. And so leaves would be better raked up and disposed of. Also, tree wrapping is very important on apples or any of the fruit trees, especially when they're young. Fruit trees have a very thin bark that's easily damaged by either rabbits, rodents, deer, or also winter sun scald reflecting off the snow that sunburns the trunks. And so wrapping with a number of different materials available from garden centers really does help. The wrapping should be applied about November 1st and then taken off the following spring. Now let's talk about the annual flower beds. What should we be doing with those in the fall of the year? Well, any of the tender flower bulbs, and when I say tender, those that would not survive the winter out in your flower bed, things like gladiolus, dahlia, canna, those all need to be dug up and then put into storage for the winter and planted out again next spring. We can also save seeds of some of the ripened pods. Some of my favorite for collecting and saving these seeds are Cleome, marigold are quite easily saved and started from seed. Zinnia also. And so it's fun to collect some of these seeds for starting in the winter for next year's. And it's also a good idea to add organic material to any flower beds, spade and rototill the flower beds, and kind of get them ready for next year. And of course, that would be an organic way of adding fertilizer to our raised flower beds. I can never resist. Some of the material that a person sees online is just interesting. So I always chuckled at that organic method of applying fertilizer to a flower bed. All right, let's move next to the perennial flower bed. Now there are certain perennials that are customarily and traditionally dug and divided in the fall of the year, such as peonies, daylilies, bleeding heart, iris are done in August and September. So all of those are dug and divided in the fall. Now, how do you know if a perennial needs digging and dividing, or should we just leave it? Well, anytime a perennial has opened up in the center, for example, a peonies can last in place for many, many years. But if the center of the peony clump ever becomes open, where all of the good material is on the outer perimeter, then it's a good sign that that needs digging and dividing. So in the fall of the year, September, a person would you can dig the entire peony or daylily or bleeding heart or iris. You can dig the entire clump and then take the good parts from around the perimeter and reset. And then you'll have lots of divisions. You can either share with others or start a new perennial bed. Or the other method is, if you don't want to dig the entire clump, you can just leave in place some of the good part and just dig away the remaining part. The preferred method usually is to dig the entire clump and then reset. One reason for that is weeds often become a problem in perennials. Perennial weeds become a problem in our flowering perennials, such as dandelions. If you get dandelions down in the middle of a daylily clump, it's kind of hard to get that dandelion root out. But when you dig and divide in the fall of the year, you can kind of separate out and wash, and making sure that you're only replanting the good perennial flower root, and you've separated off any weeds that may have invaded that clump. And the fall is a great time to plant tulips and daffodils, hyacinths. Now it's interesting. When we plant these bulbs, sometimes we think, well, gosh, they're probably just sitting there dormant until next spring, but not so. The bulbs that we plant in the fall of the year start producing roots. As soon as they're planted and as soon as they're watered, they start producing roots. And it's those roots that then will help that plant to come up in the spring of the year. So very important for tulips and daffodils, hyacinths, to plant them in September or early October to give enough time before the soil freezes solid so they can produce roots. So in North Dakota, oftentimes, depending on the year, our soil will start to freeze so you can't get a shovel down into it. Usually in anywhere from the first part of November till about the middle of November. So we really want to plant the fall bulbs really by the end of September, so they have the full month of October to root in before the soil freezes really solid. And around perennial beds or around perennial plants, we can work some organic material in around the fall of the year. Now also, should we be cutting back the above ground portions of the perennials in the fall of the year? How much cleaning up should we do? Well, most perennials, and we call them the tops. And in gardening language, the tops of a perennial plant, it's not just way up at the top. The tops refer to everything from the ground on up. The entire above ground portion is referred to as the tops of a perennial. So most are best left intact over winter. There's a couple of really good reasons for that. And one reason is our little pollinating bees our native pollinators, which are so important, so we get good fruit crops and good cucumber crops and good squash, those little pollinating bees like to nest and survive the winter in the hollow stems of perennials is one of their favorite nesting places. So if we leave the perennial tops in place like this during winter, that gives a good nesting spot for them. So it's best to leave these in place. And also they look pretty over winter. As you're looking out your window onto the perennial garden in the winter even, they look just quite decorative. And then we would cut them back in the spring of the year before growth starts really at the base. But now there are some perennial tops that should be cut back in the fall of the year, mostly because with daylily, iris, and hosta, they just become so limp. As soon as we get a good frost, they just start laying so limp. And by next spring, they're kind of just a mess and very difficult to clean up if left until spring. So those, daylily, iris, and hosta, are best cut back in the fall of the year before they get so terribly limp that you can't really handle them very well. Peony tops should also be removed. Everything from about 1 inch above ground level all the way up should all be removed on peonies for disease prevention. Peonies are really prone to leaf type diseases such as mildew, the powdery mildew. And by removing and disposing of the above ground portion of peony, we can help reduce the amount of disease that would be present. Any of perennials that you maybe plant in the fall and it's their first year, it may be wise to mulch them with a protective layer of either straw or leaves, and that mulch should be applied in early November usually. When protecting perennial flowers with a mulch in the fall of the year, it's important to let a little bit of frost get into that soil. We don't want to keep the soil too warm, otherwise we could get a little bit of mold starting down in there. So first, if we want to protect anything over winter, first it's a good idea to let a little bit of frost get into the soil in sometime in early November, and then apply your protective mulch. So next we're moving to outdoor containers. What do we do though with these in late summer, early fall? Well, it's important to remove the old plants, to kind of gently pull them up, shake off the old mix off the roots and dispose. Because if a person left the old plants in and just thought, well, I'll deal with that in the spring, there can be diseases that would overwinter in that soil. So removing the old plants is always best. So can we reuse the potting mix in our planters? And the main idea is, yes, the main concept, yes, you can certainly reuse. My wife Mary and I have reused the soil in many of our pots for probably 7 or 8 years. If you start with a high quality potting mix, a national brand that is a very good one, of course, is the Miracle-Gro potting mix. That's a good one. The Schultz brand has a very nice potting mix. Also, your locally owned garden centers will often have a brand that they recommend that they might use in their own greenhouses. So high quality potting mix will last a long time. Now, one thing though, that when we do reuse potting mix, so next spring you'll have the potting mix still in the containers, but next spring you'll fluff it up really good. And it's probably wise to add about 1/4 of new potting mix into that and then mix that in thoroughly just to give it a little bit of fresh as well. Also, many of the potting mixes have fertilizer beads, a slow release fertilizer in them. You may have heard some of these potting mixes on the bag say feeds up to 6 months, and they do. They have a slow release fertilizer. But after the first growing season, that fertilizer has been used up. So it's important when reusing potting mix to make sure that you're fertilizing. You can add slow release fertilizer again, or the water soluble types. If it's a container that might crack over winter, it's probably important to remove the potting mix to make sure it doesn't expand and crack a valuable ceramic container. Now, some plants can come on in. Plants that were in our containers during summertime can come on in so that we enjoy them during the winter. Of course, geraniums are classic. They're quite easy to survive winter, and not just survive, but to thrive in our sunny windows or even under fluorescent lights. My wife Mary and I bring in about 100 geraniums each year. We cut them back, trim them back nicely, just as I've shown there. We dig them up out of the pots and planters, trim them back well, pot them up in little 4-inch square pots. Pretty soon they sprout again, and we grow them under fluorescent lights all winter long in the basement. Or you could do the same on a very sunny window indoors. Mandevilla, Thunbergia vine, hibiscus can all spend time in the winter indoors. Important that they have enough light also. Let's talk a little bit about houseplants. And before things get too cold outside, it's a nice idea to repot any of the houseplants that do need repotting. And it's so much easier to do that outdoors than it is on the kitchen table. And so we can haul some plants outside, repot them, and bring them back on in. Or if we were looking to buy some new house plants, it's sure a lot easier to buy them from the garden center or the greenhouse in September and bring them on home than it is in January. On a beautiful day in September, when the temperatures are mild, 60s and 70s, we can buy the plants. We don't even need to cover them. But of course, in January, it's pretty hard to buy a new house plant. We have to wrap it up as you would a newborn baby because it'll easily be frost damaged. Also, treating with systemic insecticide might be a good idea. And for fungus gnats, those little annoying black bugs that flit around plants, they are coming from the potting soil. And the fungus gnat, there's a wonderful control method for those. And you might smile a little bit, but it's called mosquito bits. Now on the left-hand side, we see a product called systemic insect control that you add to the soil and it goes internally. That can be used, but also another wonderful specifically for the fungus gnats is the one I referred to as mosquito bits. These are sold at hardware stores or garden centers. And if you notice right under the label where it says mosquito bits, kills mosquitoes, it says it also controls fungus gnats. These granules are a beneficial bacteria and that is harmless to humans, of course, but they're only harmful to mosquitoes and fungus gnats. You sprinkle the granules on the potting soil, water it on in, and it inoculates the soil with these beneficial bacteria. And when these little black flies lay their eggs on the soil, the eggs hatch into a larvae, and then they are killed. So it takes a little bit of time to activate, but it breaks that life cycle of those annoying little flies. And thanks. Again, I really want to emphasize that we should look at the fall of the year as the time to already project towards next spring. So I never let myself become sad. I really love gardening, but I always look at the fall as it's a beautiful time of year, but I'm already looking forward to the investment that all this makes into next spring already. And that's what's so wonderful about gardening. It's a continual cycle. The good things that we do in the late summer, early fall are all wonderful investments to make our yards and gardens even better next year. Thank you.
Well, that was just wonderful. Don, thank you so much. And he's here with us now. We're going to visit with him a little bit, but that was just an excellent presentation. And Don, you always have the best tips. And I have just learned so much from you over the years. And those rose bushes of yours, I just can't get over how gorgeous and beautiful they are. So Don, tell us more about how you're doing and how your gardening year is going so far.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and all is going well. Right now in Fargo, we could use a little bit of rain. The lawns are starting to get a little less green than they were, so we could certainly use some rain, easily an inch or two. But I think generally it's been a good growing season for much of the state. There are always pockets that could use more moisture. Sometimes there's pockets that got a little too much moisture. But I think all in all, it's been a pretty good gardening year for most of the state. And I'm anxiously awaiting our first ripe watermelon and muskmelon. I was late planting because it was a cool, wet spring and my garden was delayed until June. So I'm still waiting for the first ripe watermelon.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Well, I tell you what, we have been having some great tomatoes, and that's what you'll see over my shoulder here. It's been a great year for tomatoes, and those I started from seed on April 3rd, so I'm pretty proud of them. So it's really, they're averaging about a half a pound each, and they're just wonderful. But Donna is asking about using a weed and feed for the lawn. And she just says, what about using a weed and feed for the lawn?
Weed and feed tend to be less effective on, especially the weed control. The fertilizer part is great, but most of our lawns are not a blanket of weeds. And so most of our lawns don't require herbicide being put over the entire lawn. And so oftentimes we've got a weed here and one there, a couple over there. And so spot spraying just the weeds is oftentimes more effective. Another thing with the weed and feed products, when we read the label, they'll give some very important factors, and some of those granules on certain products of weed and feed, some of the granules need to actually stick to the weeds, and the label oftentimes say to wet the lawn down first or apply when there's a dew so that those granules actually will stick to the weed leaves, and that's their mode of killing. Very few of those products are actually weed preventers. And so since most of us don't have a blanket of weeds, the weed and feed is usually applying product that we don't need to apply. Plus they're usually quite expensive. So a preferred option is to fertilize and then spot spray the weeds. And September is a great time for weed control.
Oh, excellent. Well, that's good to know. So, and another one regarding lawns, Lyle, who you know from here in Bismarck, is asking, what is the best way to overseed part of a lawn?
Overseeding part of a lawn, the procedure that oftentimes works really well is to first of all rake it well. A person could power rake or core aerate to remove some of the fluff so that the seed will actually come down into contact with the soil. So preparing like that, a person doesn't need to get it down to bare soil. You could add a little bit of fresh soil over those areas, leaving some of the stubble, but just to give a little better contact with the seed with some soil. Then the second most important part is keeping it moist. And it can be a little bit of a challenge to keep that area moist when there's surrounding grass, because that grass will kind of take the moisture. But keeping the seeded area very moist. I call it dark moist, where the soil would be dark with the moisture. Sometimes that will require watering 2 to 3 times a day, and that is usually the single most important factor. And if seeding doesn't take well, it's usually because the seed bed was not kept moist enough. Sometimes we can time that so that we'll seed right before a good fall rain, or if we get a week of September rainy weather, boy, if we can anticipate and seed right before that, that's ideal.
Excellent. Okay, good answer. Okay. Roger is asking about what is the best kind of peat moss to use? Burgeson's Minnesota peat is his question, if that's a good one, or if you have another idea.
Yeah, there are garden centers, especially those in Minnesota, that sell bulk peat that is from the Minnesota peat bogs. That's a wonderful material. Or also some of us that are removed a bit from the Minnesota peat bogs find that the most convenient are the bales of peat moss, the dry peat that is compressed into those bales. That works beautifully too. That is a little less broken down, but it's a great additive to our heavy soils or light sandy soils too. So either the bulk type peat, Minnesota peat, or the Canadian sphagnum peat that is sold in the large bales, that works well too.
Great. Okay, good to know. And now we have a question from Kim about when is the best time to prune trees in the spring? Like about when?
In the spring, right before they leaf out. And so each spring will vary just a little bit, but with both trees and shrubs, if we can get our pruning done right before they leaf out. The reason for that is if we delay pruning until after they've leafed out, that tree or shrub has expended some energy producing leaves that we're just going to cut off. So if we do the pruning before they've started active growth, then the tree or shrub can put that energy into the new growth in the areas that we've actually pruned. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. Maples and birch will tend to bleed if they're pruned during that time of year, such as in April, when we're usually pruning other trees and shrubs right before the growth starts. When the sap starts flowing in maples and birch about that time of year, often in probably April, even before you see leaves starting to pop out, if we do pruning at that time of year, maples and birch will bleed. It doesn't really hurt the tree because we can pump lots of sap for maple syrup out of those trees, but it causes a lot of just unsightly sap oozing down and out of those wounds. So for maples and birch, they usually recommend delaying until they're fully leafed out, and then you'll get much less sap oozing.
Okay, very good. Okay, we have another question here about, let's go to, we'll stay on the pruning here, pruning roses. What about, should you prune the roses that bloom in the fall off the rose bushes before winter?
Sure. For most of the summer season, the spent flowers, the withered flowers should be removed. We call that deadheading. And so if those are removed from a rose bush and remove it down to where you see 5 or 7 leaflets, the leaflets make up an entire leaf. So cut down a ways to right above a 5 or 7 leaflet leaf, and that will stimulate new growth and new flower buds. But from about August onward, it's better not to do that, because the spent flowers will develop into rose hips. That's the seed pod that's forming, the rose hips. And just letting all that happen naturally from about August on helps to toughen up the rose bushes. You see, if we did too much pruning on rose bushes from August on, it stimulates fresh growth that won't have time to harden up in time for winter. And so stopping the deadheading in August and just letting nature take its course, and that helps to what would you say, toughen up, stiffen up the rose bush, and they survive winter better with less winter kill.
Very interesting. Okay, very good. Connie has a question about, she said she has been cutting plants off that are in pots, both veggies and flowers, and leaving the roots in the pot until spring, as they are easier to remove. Is there a downside to this habit?
The only downside of that habit would be if there were any disease issues, if it was any fungal type diseases or anything that that you noticed during the growing season, then the entire plant root and all should be taken out. But I know what you mean. Sometimes I've left plants in the container all winter long, not just because I did it on purpose, but sometimes I just haven't gotten around to it. And sometimes then in spring, it is easier to remove some of those plants. I suppose some of the roots is disintegrated over winter. And there seems to be nothing wrong with that, as long as the plants weren't diseased going into winter.
Sure, sure. We've got another question about if part of a lawn is overgrown from reseeding, like part of it is growing 2 times as fast as the rest of it, is there anything you can do to get it more uniform without having to kill it off and reseed the whole lawn? Or when I've seen that uneven lawn stuff. Is that, how do you deal with that?
Usually they will, with patience, they will usually get back in sync. And because, yeah, sometimes a newly seeded or a newly sodded area and the other is existing, it takes a while for the two of them just to get compatible and get back in sync. But that will happen with time and with nutrition. As both areas become accustomed to the fertilizer that you gave, in time they will use, and when I say in time, it might take a couple of growing seasons, but they will usually blend together again. Sometimes that'll happen too if you've got an existing lawn and then you go to reseed. and you don't always know what grass varieties, it's probably Kentucky bluegrass, but you don't know which cultivar of bluegrass it probably was. And so you go to reseed and it probably has different Kentucky bluegrass cultivars that aren't necessarily the same shade of green, but in time it'll mesh together. But it's interesting in gardening, sometimes they're just things that that can't be rushed. Nature just has to take its course, and in time, lawns will tend to iron themselves out in that way.
Very good, very good. Okay, another question. When you say, oh, wait a minute, we've got a follow-up question to that one. What do you do if you have a lot of weeds in your lawn? Okay, and this is question, weed and feed or try to seed and hope to choke out the weeds. Well, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. Do you want to share on that again?
Yeah, if a person does need to reseed, then it's usually best. Well, a couple of ways you could do it. Weed and feed, probably not, for the reasons we mentioned. But yeah, what if the areas that you need to reseed have weeds? There are a couple of ways that a person can do that. Is first of all, deal with the weeds by applying an herbicide and kill those weeds. And right now would probably be a good time to start doing that. You know, we mentioned weed control is better done in September, but we're getting close. So maybe apply a lawn weed herbicide, but then that's going to take a while before you can reseed. Now, the cutoff date for seeding in September is usually around September 15th. So you could apply the herbicide, let those weeds die, and then wait to seed till right about September 15th. You see, if you seed too close to the time you've applied herbicide, there's damage, there's chance that that herbicide could still be too effective and would be tough on the little grass seedlings. Even if it's a lawn type herbicide that doesn't affect grass, young little grass seedlings are much more tender. Another option is to for right now, ignore those weeds and seed into it and keep it watered very well. The grass seed will usually germinate if it's not a solid carpet of weeds. And then after the lawn is mowed about 3 times, maybe that won't happen till next spring, but we can always deal with the broadleaf weeds at another time. So a couple of
Right.
options.
Yeah, that's helpful, I'm sure. You mentioned putting organic material around your perennials. What do you mean by that? What kind of organic material? What is that exactly that you're referring
Organic material could be the peat moss that we
to?
discussed. And of course, the advantage of adding organic material is it just kind of helps to mellow the soil. It helps mellow a heavy clay soil, or if the soil is so light and sandy, it gives it some moisture holding capacity. And most perennials, roses, just like a soil that's rich in that humus organic material. So we mentioned peat moss, or it could be well-rotted manure. You can buy bagged manure, or if a person gets it from a cattle producer, we need to be sure that it doesn't have herbicide that would have transmitted through, herbicide that might have been applied to a pasture. Some of those pass through the animal and can contaminate manure. So peat moss, manure, compost, your own compost, or some cities give away compost also. So that's what we mean by organic material.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wasn't sure what you were referring to there. And another question that we have here is, what is the best way to store dahlia bulbs?
Dahlia bulbs should be dug, excuse me, should be dug about the time of the first frost in the fall. You can let the foliage get a light frost. That won't hurt anything. So a person digs them up, and dyed-in-the-wool dahlia growers each have their own method for wintering them, but one method that's recommended by the American Dahlia Association, there's actually a Dahlia Association for across the nation, and one method that they recommend is to wait until about the first fall frost and then dig up the plant and cut the top off, the big stem off, a few inches above the roots. And the dahlias aren't really a bulb, they're a big tuber-like fleshy root. And you have a couple of choices. Some people will store that big that big, it's usually a system of fleshy roots all attached up by the stem. So you could put that entire thing in barely dampened peat moss or sand, or the American Dahlia Association recommends cutting it at the time of digging, cut it up into sections. Now, each section, which looks like kind of like a sweet potato, but it's important that each of those sweet potato-like sections have a bud, and those buds are located up near where the stem was. So you'll be able to see those buds up there. So a person doesn't just break off the potato-like thing and store it. You need to cut the stem so there's at least one or more buds on that upper part. And then they can be wrapped in saran wrap, the clear plastic material. That's a method that the Dahlia Association is promoting. And so they can be wrapped with that. That helps keep the moisture and helps prevent them from shriveling. Or they could be stored in barely dampened peat moss or sand. The temperature for storage should be fairly cool, not cold, but I believe the storage temperature is probably around 45 degrees.
Okay, very good. That sounds really good. But Don, any last comments or anything else that you would like to share before we kind of wrap things up here?
You know, one thing in gardening, I think we've really come to appreciate the fall. You know, we used to consider it more of, well, it's the end, but I think we're enjoying the fall more, and we're enjoying the fall colors, even the browns. There's a famous Dutch landscape architect called Piet Oudolf, who's world famous for creating these beautiful landscapes. And he said that we need to appreciate the browns of August. So we can have four true seasons of beauty. So in the fall, we've got these browns, brown muted tones that happen in our yards and gardens. And also in the winter, we think, well, guys, what beauty is there for the winter? But some of the things that we leave in the fall, such as in our perennial gardens, think of the ornamental grasses with the big seed heads that are waving. Think of those, how pretty they are in the winter landscape, and even red twig dogwoods against the snow. So some of the famous landscape architects are helping us to realize that we do have beauty for 4 seasons. Even if it's browns in the fall, the beautiful brown tones, and even our white winters have beauty.
That's right. And that's such a positive note to end on, Don. Really, really appreciate it. You've shown us how we can enjoy fall. I'm always one that gets a little sad when fall comes because I'm a summer lover, but this is a good way to think about it and a good way to prepare our views for the winter and make sure we have that beauty all year round. So thank you so much, Don. We just really, really enjoy having you here with us.
Thank you for inviting me, and have a great late summer and fall.
Okay, will do. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us for the Get Your Yard Ready for Fall program, part of the Passport to Healthy Living program for 2020.